as Steve sort of suggested, I probably prepared too much. I've been working on this. This is the first talk I've given on this book I've been working on. And it's very much in progress, so of course all feedback would be great. So two main goals for the talk. I want to first lay out what Steve Heine and R. Norn-Zion and I called the weird people problem. This is really the point of departure for what I then want to explain. So for those of you who might not know, so we use this acronym WEIRD to stand for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And starting in about 2006 and 7, Steve and R and I began to have a series of lunches together. And in talking about our different areas of expertise, we began to notice that Westerners, the subjects typically studied by psychologists, not only were they one population among many in terms of psychological diversity, but they were often at the end of the distribution, peculiar or outliers in some way. So this led to a long-running collaboration where we put together as many data sets as we could find that had typical subjects, typical university undergraduates, say, in a Western society, along with people from other societies, and just lay it all out. What does it all look like? And in data set after data set, Westerners come out at one end of the distribution or the other. Now, it's not always the case. We did find a few cases where they came out somewhere in the middle, or some cases, actually a number of cases in which there wasn't much variation. But in lots of things that are central topics in psychology and related disciplines, we find Westerners to be psychologically peculiar. And this seems to affect many different aspects of psychology, so perception, memory, reasoning, a number of other areas. Just to give you a sense of, now the problem with this is, of course, that the sampling approach in psychology is quite biased towards Western undergraduates. So on the time we were writing this up, a study came out reviewing social psych journals, and this indicated that 96% of participants in social psych experiments were from Western populations, and most of these were undergrads. About 70% of them were Americans, who turned out to be among the weirdest of the weird. Now, within psychology, our paper seems to have been widely read, but it's been mostly taken as a kind of methodological critique, a problem with sampling or something like that. And I actually think the problem runs a lot deeper, that it's actually a theoretical problem. It has to do with the place of theory in organizing inquiry in psychology. But where I want to go with this talk is actually to say, okay, so I think Steve and R have identified a pattern of psychology across populations. And I want to see if we can explain that pattern. Where does this pattern come from? So to try to build a theory of where this unique psychological pattern comes from. So in some sense, I'm going to be suggesting that cultural evolution is psychological evolution. That as cultures change, as institutions change, as new technologies emerge, this is co-evolving with psychological difference, which are moving along together as part of the story. So we need a theory that can interweave changes in the information processor with changes in society as we see it. And just one thing to kind of keep in the background, it's kind of a meta point, is that one of the, I'm sort of an outsider. I came into psychology in 2006 and got to hang around with many psychologists. And I find that there's this kind of digital computer metaphor. Steve and I have actually discussed this. Which pervades people's thinking, and it's the idea that psychologists study the processor, the hard drive, and the math coprocessor and whatnot, and the culture stuff is the stuff that gets poured in. That doesn't seem to be the way it works. It seems like the machine is partially constructed during ontogeny, that the information processing abilities are emerging along with the rest of the machine. Okay. Now, if you push psychologists on that, they'll immediately back off, and they won't defend the digital computer metaphor, but I think it does pervade people's thinking. So let me just show you a little bit about the weird people problem. Okay, so perceptual judgment. This is Steve and R's favorite go-to example on this. Most of you are probably familiar with this, the Mueller-Lyer Illusion. Yesterday I had my lab manager, Colin, running around to find cognitive psychology textbooks, because I wanted to double check that, in fact, it doesn't say in the cognitive psychology textbooks that this is highly variable across societies, and it does not. It's typical illusion. So people in this room will see line B as longer than line A, and you can measure the strength of this illusion by lengthening line A up. Where's my pointer? By lengthening line A until such a point as the participant sees line A as equivalent to line B. So this is the point of subjective equivalence, when they look the same. So that's a measure of the strength of the illusion, and that's plotted here along the vertical axis. So these are a bunch of different societies, and this was a collaboration, a study done in 15 different populations. Most of these societies are different African populations. This one's in the Philippines. These are actually hunter-gatherers in the southern Kalahari. And it was done, Don Campbell, who's a famous psychologist, many of you will know, along with a psychologist named Melvin Herskovitz, collected this data with their collaborators. And you can see the illusion goes from non-existent. So the San hunter-gatherers don't see the illusion, all the way up to its strongest is these are undergraduates at Northwestern University. If I was to plot children on here, children from ages 5 to 9, it would mirror the same pattern. There are some differences between the children, but it basically follows it. Okay, so differences in perception. These guys studied 5 other illusions. You also see differences between populations in the susceptibility to this illusion. Okay, well, why would this be? So the best theory I've seen to explain this, and this is actually the one place where I'm going to give you an explanation before I get to the main course, is that how we see is light projects a 2-dimensional image on our retina. And then our brain has to do some mathematical calculations, essentially, to this 2-dimensional image to convert it into a 3-dimensional image. So it turns it back into, so in order to do that, it has to make assumptions about angles and shading and this kind of thing. So the idea is that in our world, we have ontogenetically adapted to a world with lots of 90-degree angles, lots of carpentered corners. So if you look around this room, it's got 90-degree angles on the table, and the corners of the room are 90-degree angles, the doors are all 90-degree angles. But this is a very unusual visual environment. This is not the visual environment that most humans have encountered over human evolutionary history. In fact, it's just a product of a particular cultural evolutionary trajectory where you had to have carpenters, so 90-degree angles. Okay, so that was just a little bit on visual illusions, a little bit on prosocial motivations now, impersonal fairness. So I actually began this research 20 years ago. This very first project, so this is a volume documenting our first project published in 2004. We assembled a team of anthropologists at UCLA. We trained them in a bit of game theory and developed a protocol together to administer something called the ultimatum game in 15 diverse societies. In these experiments, you put a sum of real money on the line, so we put 1 day's wage on the line, and individuals have to decide how to divide up this money between themselves and another anonymous person. We then, we received a lot of criticism. There was a paper in Behavioral and Brain Science, and we redesigned a second project. We went out, we replicated our prior results, and extended to new experiments and new populations. And so this book came out in 2014. Okay, so this is a sampling of the societies we did in our second project. So we went all over the world. So these are populations of herders and hunter-gatherers and agriculturalists in Africa, townspeople in Accra in Ghana, horticulturalists in different parts of New Guinea, hunter-gatherers and herders in Siberia, horticulturalists in the South Pacific, that's my field site, various horticulturalists in the Amazon. And we did undergraduates at Emory University, but we also went to a small town in rural Missouri and recruited townspeople from this small rural town. All right, so a couple thousand subjects from a variety of different economic lifestyles, a bunch of different economic data, network data to go along with that. Now, to say a little bit more about the experiments, we had a package of 3 of these behavioral experiments. And let me just explain. Many of you are familiar with these games, so I don't want to spend too much time, but not everyone will be. So let me tell you about the ultimatum game. So we put 1 day's wage on the line, so say $100. And there's 2 players in this game. They're anonymous to each other, and they interact in a one-shot game. So they're not going to see that person again, and they're assured of this. So the job of the first player is to offer a portion of this $100 to the second player. So say they offer $10 out of the 100, keeping 90 for themselves. The second player, before they see the amount of the offer, they have to say whether they would accept or reject each of the possible offers that has been offered to them before they know about it. And then whatever they say is implemented. So if they said they would reject the $10, if they said they would accept the $10, then they get the $10 and the first player gets 90. If they said they would reject, both players go home with 0. So in this game, offers are a measure of fairness. How much am I willing to share this with you? But it also captures something about my fear that you might reject me. And this could vary in different ways across societies. You can set the kind of benchmark for what the economists would predict. So what do you get if you predict, if you use the canonical assumptions of game theory? You would predict that proposers, the first player, should offer a very small amount to the second player, but above 0, so maybe the $10. And then the second player should always accept because they're given a choice between 0 or nothing. As long as they like money, they should take the $10. Now, the one thing I can tell you, having done this in many different societies, is that the canonical prediction from economics is completely wrong. It doesn't actually pan out anywhere. But you do get great diversity among societies. All right. Then we can go to the dictator game. So this is like the ultimatum game, but now we remove the opportunity to reject from the second person. So the first player makes an offer, and this is just implemented, and the cash is given out. Now there, the self-interested benchmark is 0, give 0. And so that's just a measure of impersonal fairness or your concern with the other person. So everything's anonymous. And then in the third-party punishment game, which I won't say very much about, but in this game, A and B play a dictator game. So A is given a sum of money, they can give it to B. And C is given half the amount that A and B are dividing up. And C can punish A if they don't like how much A gives. So there, A's offer depends on how much they want to give to B, and also on their concerns that they might get punished by C. So you get measures of third-party punishment and also this kind of fairness measure. There, A should give 0 because C should never pay anything to punish because there's no benefit. There's no chance to cash in on that. All right. So all the offers in these 3 games look roughly the same across society. So the vertical axis here is the average offer in the dictator game across these diverse societies. You can see the adults in rural Missouri, non-students there. Hadza here, they're hunter-gatherers in Tanzania. Chimane are horticulturalists in Bolivia, and then a wide range of different groups, going from about 26% up to 48%. I show you the ultimatum game. It would look very similar. Third-party punishment game, similar as well. So a great deal of variation in this game. Now, that might be unsurprising to you, depending on what kind of background you bring into this. But I can show you lots of papers, actually from the late 90s and well into the 21st century, saying that there's a result in this game, and it's this result, right? Because they don't know about this other research, or sometimes they still say that. And anyway, not everybody gets it after a while. Anyway, so so it was assumed that this was representative of humans. It turns out to be at the end of the distribution. So you'd hear, I don't want to pick on evolutionary psychologists, but you'd hear evolutionary psychologists saying, this is our reciprocity psychology firing up. When actually in face-to-face societies, people don't behave like that. All right. Now, I also wanted to show something to developmental psychologists. So we were wondering what the ontogenetic origins of these behaviors were. So my collaborator Joan Silk and I assembled a group, including Bailey House, who's the first author on this paper, published in PNAS a few years ago. And we got researchers to do a very simple game that's like the dictator game, so it involves divisions between individuals. And there they can choose between A, which is a 1-1, so you get 1 candy, I get 1 candy, or B, 2 for me, 0 for you. So I keep all the candy and you get nothing. And we didn't want there to be any methodological concerns with whether the kids believe that there was this anonymous other individual. There's a bunch of ways to deal with that. So we just sat the kid right there. So you see the kid get the candy, right? So the question is, what do these kids in different places do when they're faced with this choice? We actually did a number of different experiments, but I'm just going to show you one. So we also did it with 120 adults, and like I said, 326 children from ages 3 to 14. So kids in Los Angeles, in Fiji, in the Central African Republic, so these are hunter-gatherers. These are pastoralists in Namibia, and then horticulturalists in Ecuador, and former hunter-gatherers in Australia. Okay, so now these are the best fit curves across the age group, starting with the 3-year-olds and going up to age 14, and the adults are plotted here. Now, the interesting thing we found is that there's this nonlinear relationship, and it turns out that these U-shaped patterns are not uncommon in developmental work. So some of the groups started out a bit pro-social, the 3-year-olds, then they got selfish. So this is the probability of the 1-1 choice, so the even split. So if you're higher, you're more fair. You go down, and then sometime in middle childhood, things begin to take off, and they go up to where the adults are, except this group, which just continues to go down. Now, if you had to guess who are the Westerners, what's the LA group? It's the one that stands out. It's the red group. So you can see there's the American group. So they're developing faster than everybody else, which means if you're a developmentalist, you ought to worry about those milestones. because these guys seem to be ahead of everyone else. Okay, so that's the costly sharing game. Another domain that's common in social psychology anyway is a long history of studies on conformity. So most of you are probably familiar with the ASH test. So subjects are asked to match this line with one of these target lines. Which one does it match in length? Most people by themselves will get this right 96% of the time. They'll pick C. But you can set up the experiment so you have two confederates go first, and they both pick A. And then the question is, how often does the subject go along with the other two guys instead of picking what they would have picked had they been alone? I got this data from Damien Murray, actually, who compiled it from a paper by Smith and Bond. So if you compile all the weird societies, which are not very different, you get this. This is the effect size in the experiment. And you can see the weird people are here at one end, and then it's quite variable across these different societies. Now, Zimbabwe might look like an outlier, but the kind of social structure that they have in Zimbabwe is actually more similar to how humans have been for good chunks of history. So this is probably more representative of humans over historical time than these other groups. All right. Reasoning and field dependence. Okay, so there's, of course, a long history of research on analytic versus holistic thinking. Just to give you a quick primer on it, I know many of you are familiar with it. In analytic thinking, there's a tendency to reason by focusing on objects, by assigning property to those objects, and by explaining behavior by reference to those properties. Use category-based reasoning. So, for example, if F and B can be particles, or they could be people. But if you want to explain their behavior, you assign properties to them. So F might be lazy and B might be bossy. And then you can explain what the interaction is between F and B. This was viewed as the dominant mode of thinking for a while by psychologists and philosophers. The other mode of thinking is holistic thinking. So there you focus on relationships. You take into account whole context. You look for overall gestalt similarity, and you see cyclical patterns instead of linear patterns. So research by Dick Nesbitt, R. Norton Zion, and their colleagues back in the 90s showed that this is the dominant reasoning style in Eastern societies. But when I came in 2006 and I first encountered R. Norton Zion, I'd been hanging out in Michigan for a while with Dick. R and I both had the same title of the paper we wanted to write. And the paper was More Chinese Than the Chinese. And the reason we both had that title is because the Chinese were held out to be, this holistic thinking population. But Ara had done experiments amongst Middle Easterners and found the Middle Easterners he was studying were way more holistic than the Chinese he'd previously studied. And I'd been doing work with indigenous populations in Chile, and I found that they were way more holistic than the same protocols. I actually got the protocols from Nesbitt, and than the Chinese. So it began to look like a West versus the West pattern rather than an East versus West pattern. Okay. And the other interesting thing about this, and this is actually drawing on some of Ara's work, which is that not only are there differences in the style of reasoning, but there's differences in what people think is normatively correct reasoning. So in Ara's work, it seems that people in Hong Kong, I believe, think that for at least some kinds of problems, that the holistic answer is the right answer, and they would defend that, whereas the Westerners would defend the analytic answer. So normative differences. Okay, there's a number of different ways that people have tried to measure this. Again, I know many of you are familiar with this. So a typical way is triads. So in this, let's see, what's the best way to do this? So the target item is the glove, and analytic answer is to match the glove with the scarf, so both kinds of winter wear, so a category-based distinction. Or you can put the gloves with the hand, a functional relationship. Gloves go on the hand and they keep it warm. This is a rule-based or a gestalt similarity-based test. So here's the target object, and you got to say whether it goes with A or with B. The analytic answer is to recognize that all these have the same stem. So by that rule, you should put this flower in this group, all similar stems, so you have a rule-based way of doing it. Or overall gestalt similarity puts the flower in this group. And then finally, there's perceptual outcomes of these differences in thinking, which I won't say anything about here, but I like the perceptual ones because there's a right and wrong answer, and you show the same patterns. Okay, so this is some data that Ara, Steve, and I assembled for our Weird People paper. And so the vertical axis is the percent to which people gave analytic answers versus holistic answers. for these different populations. And this is using the protocol, the flower one I just described. So you can see that the European Americans are high on the analytic answers, whereas the East Asians are low and tend toward to be holistic. And as I mentioned, we have data that suggests, not in this exact experiment, which is why it's not on this graph, but that suggests that other populations would be even more holistic than the East Asian group. All right. Okay, so I could go on and on and on, actually. So I've shown you some visual perception, some impersonal fairness, some conformity, reasoning styles and field dependence. I cut the field dependence. And I could go on and show you measures of cooperation and punishment, the effectiveness of punishment. It works in some places, doesn't work in other places. The fundamental attribution error, which many of you are familiar with, doesn't turn out to be very fundamental. The endowment effect, so made famous by Dan Kahneman, turns out to depend on market integration. Cognitive dissonance doesn't generalize. Spatial and numerical cognition turn out to vary. Folk biological cognition turns out to vary. So much work on the development of folk biological cognition is done with children from urban environments. And it now looks like when the same work has been done with children in rural societies and in small-scale societies, that the urban children were getting depauperate input. In order to get the system up and functioning, it relies on a certain amount of input about details about plants and animals, exposure to nature. And if you grow up in an urban environment, you don't do that. So you end up with, it's kind of like studying human development and anatomy by studying malnourished children because they're not getting the input that would lead to the normal maturation of the system. And then finally, moral foundations. And interestingly, the use of intentions in moral judgment varies tremendously. So I could show you a plot that would show you that Westerners at the far end are extremely interested in the importance of intentions in making moral judgments in ways that other populations aren't. Okay. So that's the problem. So there's all this variation, and the question is, can we take out a chunk of that variation and try to explain it? Okay. Now, a common view, or at least what I think a lot of people might jump to try to explain this variation, was something that's captured here. So it could be that this is all just the result of modern economic growth, the fact that we live in wealthy societies and we have fancy formal institutions, democracy and capitalism might cause this kind of weird psychology. I put small families in here because you could also make the same story about small families. Families are going to play a role in my story. Okay, but what I'm going to be laying out here gradually is that my view is actually that the spread of a particular religion, a particular variant of Christianity, tore down the complex kinship systems of Western Europe, led to small nuclear families, which changed our psychology, leading to more individualistic psychology with a whole bunch of the patterns that I laid out. And this paved the way for the emergence of modern social institutions. So I think psychologists could like this. It puts psychology and psychological differences at the origins of Western civilization. So that should be good. We're important. Now, of course, there's going to be feedback here. So there's feedback in a lot of these things. But I'm just, there's actually good reason to believe this was a true first move here. Okay, now I want to start with a microcosmic example to kind of work you into this. And I thought I would do it in this way. So your brain, I feel confident I can say this about everybody's brain, has been modified by the acquisition of a particular skill. Most people in most societies throughout human history have never acquired this skill. It has thickened your corpus callosum. It has specialized a region of your brain in the left ventral occipital temporal region. This develops around age 8. It's altered part of your superior temporal sulcus and left inferior prefrontal cortex, or Broca's area. It's improved your verbal memory, created more overall brain activation when you hear speech, and shifted your facial recognition from being equal in your two hemispheres to being right dominant. And it's made you worse at identifying faces. So that, of course, many of you know this, that this skill is literacy, right? So you learn to read through a long, hard process, and this changed your brain. This made you biologically different from populations that aren't literate. Okay, now an unwitting neuroscientist might study a bunch of undergraduates and conclude that humans are naturally right dominant for face processing. But when you study illiterates, they're not right dominant, they're equally balanced. It looks like that to construct the letterbox, what Stanislaw Dehaene calls the letterbox, in the left side, being near language and some other important areas, you need to drive face processing out, and you drive it right. Now, of course, there's controversy about that, but as a preliminary point. So people become psychologically different, and it changes their face processing and verbal memory. So now I wanted to emphasize that it says on this cultural evolutionary trajectory because it actually depends on the specifics of the writing system that evolved. And I'll say more about that in a second. And I just want to mention that there's at least a little bit of evidence to suggest that if you are literate and you then spend your time reading fiction, you become more empathetic to strangers. So when you're comparing empathy in populations, you should take into account their fiction reading habits. All right, I wanted to quickly point to Mayan. Because Mayan was this language for 600 years made use of faces as part of the writing system. So it's probably a good bet that if we did the same kind of studies of Mayan literates, we would find that they might be less dominant for facial processing because if you read a lot, you spend your whole day looking at faces and trying to make distinctions between all these different kind of faces. And all these different kind of faces. So it might have quite a different effect on your brain learning to read Mayan. Okay, although I think faces might be on the comeback. So that may yet change as we begin to use facial representations in writing. All right. Now, this just brings the question, so how did we become literate? So we're backing up down the causal trail. The evolution of writing systems doesn't do it. Writing systems emerged thousands of years ago. Most people aren't literate. Historians can fight about this, but probably no more than about 10% of people were literate in most societies. So then the question is, why did things change? Now again, you could go to your, hey, it's when we got rich. No, it came before the rich. It began spreading to high frequency in Europe in the 16th century. So just in your mental timeline, Industrial Revolution 1750, really not taken off till 1800, not making big changes until 1850. So late on the timeline. So these are, let's see, so this is this is data from Clark's book called Farewell to Alms, and this is the percent of adults who are literate, 1550, 1900, and you can see that literacy is climbing up here, and there's the women climbing up. He's put together a bunch of different data sets. The only graph I could find for France, so 1720, 1885, and literacy is going down. So I should have replotted it, but I ran out of time. So they're both telling the same story in France and England. Okay, now historians want to argue about this, but I think the best case for why Europe began to become literate was because Protestants got this idea that everybody should read the Bible in their own tongue. And they began printing a lot of Bibles. Rich women would set up places where they would tutor young children in learning to read so they could read the Bible. So it was in order to read God's word in their own language. And you might not realize this, I know this because of some of my field work, but there are today missionaries, Protestant missionaries all over South America teaching people to read the Bible in their own language. It's a millenarian movement, but it's funded by millions of dollars from the Bible Belt. So this actually is still happening today. Okay, now this line is a line about literacy, but assuming we can extend the neuroscience, it's actually a line about biological changes in brain. So when you learn to read, your corpus callosum thickens. This means that this is a line about biological changes in people's brains. All right. So just to kind of, if you want to understand the psychology and the neuroscience that's behind literacy, you have to begin to walk backwards. So what is the child's world like when they're growing up and learning to read? And then how did that world in which they grow up in and learn to read get that way? So an obvious thing would be schools, except schools obviously play an important role, but schools, at least as created by states, are late in the story. So literacy rates are already high before states like France and England have institute schools. And at least my kids, so we might be at a point now where my kids could already read when they went to school. They just sort of learn because we read to them a lot. And then you get back to this religious belief. So if you want to be able to understand these patterns of psychology, you go back to this religious belief. Okay. Now, I just want to briefly broaden this out for a second to say a few things about thinking in terms of cultural evolution and the things that shape our psychology. So I divided this into tools, institutions, and language. And I just want to say a few things. So I mentioned the carpentry method. So that's affecting our susceptibility to visual illusions. Reading literacy affects our psychology. And there's a whole long list. So these are just a few samples. I'll just mention this one. If you want to study numerical cognition, you have to realize that most societies throughout most of human history counted 1, 2, 3 many. So the group I worked with in Peru counted that way. And so you, by cultural inheritance, acquired a system of numbers with 0, which is only invented twice in human history, in which you can count without bound. But most people don't get that. And having grown up in that world, that's going to affect your numerical cognition. And there's lots of other things that could be important here. Language is important. So languages are quite diverse. There's been a lot of work on the effects of spatial reference systems. So English, when you learned English, you got 3 spatial reference systems. Some languages only have 1 spatial reference. Everything's done by north, south, east, and west, absolute coordinate system, rather than a relative coordinate system with right and left. Just to give you a sense of the diversity of languages, so most of you probably have about 70,000 words in your vocabulary, which means that the course of development you had to learn 70,000 words. The entire dictionary of small-scale societies is 3,000 to 5,000 words. Phonemes, so languages, the smallest scale human societies have 10, 11, 12, you can argue about the details there, about a dozen phonemes. English has mid-30s, 3 times that in phonemes, and some languages have 140 phonemes. So quite a difference in the number of phonemes you have to learn. And then languages are kind of like an institution that they force you to do things. So some languages force you to track status, some gender, some evidence. So there are languages in South America where when you say something, it's grammatically marked as to whether you saw that happen or somebody told you whether that happened. I wish we had that in English. I'd like to introduce it. And then, of course, in some languages, you have to track tense and number. But what I'm really interested in are the institutions. So I'm going to be talking about religion and kinship and marriage. Now, if you open an anthropology textbook, anthropologists often reflect what the people in different societies care about. And that's kind of one of the prime directives, is pay attention to what the people you're studying pay attention to. So anthropology textbooks always have chapters on religion, kinship, and marriage, and often more than 1 chapter. If you open a social psychology textbook to those chapters, you'll be hard-pressed because there aren't any chapters on marriage, kinship, or religion. Okay. So now I want to talk about how institutions affect psychology. So it happens, I didn't know I was going to need to know this when I started down this road to explain weird people. But when I went to graduate school, I wanted to understand the evolution of societal complexity. So how humans got from relatively small-scale hunter-gatherer societies about 12,000 years ago to complex nation-states. So in this, I'm going to now summarize the entire field on 1 slide. So you start with relatively small bands organized by some kind of bilateral descent system. So you're related to mom and dad's relatives. There's systems of reciprocity and norms and rituals that help bind people together. But then agriculture emerges, and you got to get bigger and bigger groups who can control territory, deal with the other guys, set up defense, and store and do all kinds of practical things. Now, the way you build this is you begin extending the kinship system. So now you have a bunch of people you call brother. They're not actually your brothers, but you're supposed to treat them like brothers, and there are norms that enforce that. Norms about residence, you always have to live where your brothers live, for example. And that's because as brothers, you can all work together, and you have cousins you call brothers, and so you can form this big, say, cooperative group for defense. And then there's rules about ownership. You don't own things individually, you own things as a group, so you all have a stake in this, right? And it descends to your children. This results in things like ancestor worship, inherited status, common ownership, and clans, unilineal descent systems. Most common form of kinship system in the anthropological record. Now the trail seems to go from there, I'll get back to that trail in a second. There's this other trail that anthropologists call big man systems, and these are kind of like the prestigious ruler of the house. So you have a bilateral system, so moms and dads, relatives. You achieve status through getting everyone to work together, to cooperate, trading on your prestige. You have the systems of reciprocity and debts in which you can use to build this network, which are working together. So it's the house model. When primitive money pops up, it's in this system. It's not in this system. All right, now this system then goes to simple chiefdoms. So one of the clans or one of the kin groups becomes superior to the others. And that's where the chief is, and he begins to give orders to everybody else. This eventually, they conquer other groups and they become complex chiefdoms. Sometimes this moves into a segmentary lineage system. There we're all equals, but if we need a bunch of guys for defense, a bunch of people for defense, we can call upon our lineage brothers, and this can get pretty large. These spread all throughout Africa in historical time. Now in this case, in the complex chiefdom, this is a pretty complex social organization. But at the top, it's still relatives. It's still people who are operating through the idiom of kinship. They're marrying each other. They're trying to keep a web of kin relationships. And it's only when you get to states that you get a professional bureaucracy that's often meritocratic that begins to pull apart from the kinship system. And then these states begin to push back. The kinship system is really a problem, but they can only push back so far because the entire society is built on top of a complex kinship system. Okay, so this is the normal path of the emergence of complex states, with this underlie at its foundation a complex kinship system. But what I'm arguing is that how we get to weird psychology is that there was an event, a particular religious group decided to do things a bit differently, that demolished this, and ended up with a simple kinship structure which allowed for the emergence of new forms of social organization. All right, so quick bit of history. I didn't know how much people know about history. I'm never clear on that with psychologists. So Julius Caesar shows up in England. He conquers it, as Julius Caesar does. He comes back and eventually crosses the Rubicon. This Roman Civil War starts. Rome goes from a republic to an empire. All right, so this is the beginning of the spread of Christianity, first century. Constantine, Christianity becomes the state religion of Rome, 412. Rome didn't really fall in the usual sense people think about it, but it was conquered and sacked in 476. So a bunch of Arian Christian Goths sack Rome. And so this is the Middle Ages. And then here we have the Norman conquest of England. So a bunch of Vikings who settled in France conquer England. Printing press is invented here. Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg church in 1517, and then there's Columbus. Okay, so European kinship system. We have just enough evidence to say there's a variety of different kinship systems in Europe at this point. So cousin marriage is popular, lots of polygamy, lots of patrilocality, so you have to live where your dad lives, adoption, and slaves. By this point, simple kinship system, monogamy, love, marriage is neolocal residence. And I'm leaving most of the history out of this talk, but there's a long line of evidence suggesting that this was a systematic program in which one branch of Christianity, the Roman Catholic Church, prevented, they made a rule, no cousin marriages, so you can't marry any of your cousins. You must live separate from your parents. You have to set up your own household, and if you don't, we won't marry you. No adoption. So adoption disappears out of the Western tradition until the mid-19th century, when the US is the first Western country to re-permit adoption. And then the UK doesn't do it until the 20th century. Monogamous marriage, so you cannot have a second wife, and if you do, we will excommunicate you. And there's papal records about excommunications occurring to various Anglo-Saxon chiefs because, they liked having second wives, I guess. You also couldn't marry your affines. Which might sound like a weird thing, but in complex kinship systems, you have to figure out what to do with widows, right? Men usually die first, and then you're left with widows. And in many systems, the husband's brother gets the wife. She just becomes a second wife to him. Kids are raised by their uncle. Everything goes from there. And if there's no brother, there's a classificatory brother, some other cousin who's called brother, and the wife goes to them. All right. So the key thing that I'm not emphasizing enough is that the things that the church is tabooing, is making wrong, is working against, are all the tools that cultural evolution had used in the evolution of complex kinship systems. All these kind of marriage systems and residence and stuff, these are all the things that allowed it to bind people together to build larger groups. All right. So these decrees over hundreds of years result in the destruction, the dismantling of the complex kinship systems, resulting in just nuclear families. And this creates a psychological effect, so individualism or analytic thinking is going to be caused by this. All right. Now, I've previously done a lot of work on monogamous marriage, so this arrow actually is going from monogamous marriage to these psychological traits. So one thing that there's some evidence for, not only does it have these psychological effects, but having normative monogamy reduces male testosterone. So we have a biological link for some of this stuff. All right. Now, when you destroy these kinship systems, this is the social security net. So the complex networks of kinship are what happens when you get sick or hurt or you die. Where do your children go? Well, they would go to your kin, and your kin would take care of them all. But if you lose that, the church has a solution. They create these non-kin-based social safety nets. So there's all these widows they're creating, and those widows are being used to care for the orphans, which they created when they outlawed adoption. Okay. Now, this psychology, combined with the fact that these are nuclear families, leads to a great deal of mobility in medieval Europe. So people are moving around, and in fact, these voluntary organizations are popping up. So these are groups of non-relatives who are choosing to be together because they have some shared interest. Charter towns pop up. Here you apply. I would like to be a part of your charter town. And you don't apply as a kin group or any kind of large clan. You apply as an individual or a household. And so they have to decide to govern these, and towns are competing. Okay. So I just want to give you a sense of what's happening when you're tearing down and think about this from the point of view of a young learner. What's happening to the children? The road to success in a complex kinship system are to basically follow the rules and be respected by the other members of your group, because they're your social security net. The way these systems are often organized, if you violate a norm, you bring shame on everybody else. And so they have an incentive to make sure you stay in line. So you create this interlocking system. Once you break that down, they don't have any power over you. So just think about the effect of neolocal residence. So now the son doesn't live under his father's thumb anymore. You know, of course, there's always going to be some kind of authority-based relationship, but he has his own household now. Okay, so there's going to be new pieces of psychology are going to be demanded, and cultural evolution is going to favor those, ontogenetic development should favor those, of how you make your way in a world where you can't take advantage of all these kin networks. What's going to matter are your personal attributes, because you've got to go out. You're forced to go out and make these relationships with strangers or non-kin. Even finding a wife is tough, because you can't marry anybody you know, because they're all our affines or cousins or some kind of thing, the way these things usually go. And so relationships are by choice. Okay. All right. So once you begin to get this kind of psychology down, then you can give rise to impersonal markets. There's a great deal of exchange that pops up, and this is going to markets lead to more impersonal prosociality. All these voluntary organizations begin competing, and this is going to have a psychological effect. Okay, so what I've set up here is a kind of research program. It's a research program that combines historical evidence and psychological evidence. So first, these are historical linkages, so I'm not going to dwell on those. Either the historical record confirms those, or they don't confirm those, or it's ambiguous. But these are psychological linkages. So these are cases where experiments from psychology could either prove or disprove, provide evidence for or against these various linkages. So it's a research program. You might be thinking, well, you're talking about stuff that happened in medieval Europe. How could you possibly test those ideas? Well, it's a theory, though, right? It's a theory, so it should work in other kinds of contexts. So I can't test those people, the people in medieval Germany or France, but I can test whether dismantling the kinship systems or reducing the importance of kinship systems has these psychological effects. I can test whether greater market contact leads to greater impersonal sociality. So I can fill in the arrows and I can test them with psychological evidence. So let's take a look at the first one. So now I'm going to go to this paper by Thomas Talhelm in Science. And so the historical argument is the church made a series of decrees. It reduced the importance of complex kinship systems, which led to this. Now, in principle, you could actually test this in the world today because the church is still at it. And there are places that are partially Christianized with partially dismantled kinship systems. But I didn't find any of that evidence. What I do have is ecological differences will also increase or decrease the importance of complex kinship systems. And I can look at the effects of that. So what Talhelm argues is that wet paddy rice cultivation requires large amounts of cooperative behavior. In China, this means patrilineal clans. So if you have paddy rice agriculture, you intensify the importance of clans. So if the theoretical link I want is important, then paddy rice should be associated with more clans, and that should be associated with the psychological properties. So this is a picture of China. This is the more or less the non-rice region, lots of wheat there, a kind of border region where you find both, and then lots of rice here. So what Talhelm did is he calculated the percentage of land devoted to rice versus other kinds of agriculture. And then he measured the did psychological measures in these different places and looked for the relationship. So they used a couple of different measures. I'll just mention two of them. So they used implicit egoism. And here you just ask participants to draw their social network, them and each subject and their close friends. And you look at how big they make the me circle. And if they're implicitly egoistic, they think it's all about them, they make the me circle bigger. If they make it the same size as their friends, they're just seeing themselves as one amongst the social network. And you can also do the triads, which I mentioned before. So here, the analytical answer is 2 animals, and the holistic answer is rabbits eat carrots. So you can do regressions with this. You can control for lots of stuff that varied among the provinces and among the individuals, but this picture tells the story. So the wheat provinces tended to draw themselves bigger when they drew the social network. So the me circle was larger than the other circles. It was about 1.5 millimeters bigger on average. And the rice regions, there was no difference between that. Americans tend to draw themselves about 6 millimeters bigger. Europeans are about 3.5 millimeters bigger, and Japanese are slightly smaller than the other people in their group. I assume Canadians are probably 5 millimeters, based on my experience. All right, and then, so this is the percent of land devoted to rice paddies versus wheat, corn, and other kinds of things. And this is the percent of holistic categorization, so the time you went rabbit, carrot. So you can see more land devoted to rice paddies, more holistic answers. And it seems like when you get rice paddies, you end up with holism. If you have not very many rice paddies, you may or may not have holistic psychology. So this supports the basic idea. And I've since gathered clan data from the economic historian Avner Greif. And you can show that land that had more percent cultivated to rice do in fact have more clans. Okay, time, okay. So now, and basically I'm just, my book is walking my way through the chart, right? What's the evidence? Okay, so what about this? Do we have a relationship between residential mobility, relational mobility, and psychological consequences? So what happens, there's a research program on this within social psychology. The two lead researchers are Shigi Oishi and Masaki Yuki. It's been done in the US, the UK, and Japan. And basically, Shigi Oishi tends to focus, or he exclusively focuses on residential mobility. So he's looking at people who have moved, and he's looking at how their psychology is different from non-movers. He also does priming experiments where he says things like, imagine you moved a lot, and tries to get to causality that way. I must say I have a kind of dubious uncertainty about the pretend you moved a lot, but that's what he found. So he finds that people who move a lot and people who are asked to think about moving a lot prefer helpers who are more egalitarian inclinations, just help strangers equally, over those who prefer in-group loyalty, stay close to your kith and kin. So that's the kind of thing we'd expect. So if you are actually forced to move due to neolocal resonance, the fact that you're now no longer attached to this complex kinship network, you can move to the town because you don't have any ancestors to worry about back in the land, or you don't have communal ownership of that land anymore. You move, and you're going to be more inclined towards egalitarian relationships, egalitarian motivations. He also finds that moving causes people to want to expand their network. Now, this other construct, relational mobility, is just a kind of subjective measure of people, the degree to which they feel like they can switch relationships. And that is associated with several aspects of individualism as well as less shame proneness. So one of the things I think that's going on there is guilt's becoming more important in Europe, and Christianity is helping with that. But there's also these factors of shame is tightly bound up with these complex kinship systems. So if you're allowing greater relational mobility, your less shame reduces in relative importance. Okay, and just a final point on this residential mobility question. So now we can go to economics. Because these guys, psychologists treat these as ecological factors. It's like they're the weather or geography or something. But we know from economics that these are cultural traits. So the way the economists study this, it's a powerful technique, I think. They look at places like the US and Europe, where there's lots of migrants. And then they look at second and third generation migrants. So people who may have not actually ever been back to the home country where their parents or grandparents are from. So they grew up entirely in another place. And then they try to predict their behavior based on the averages from the home country of migration. And these are powerful predictors of behavior. Now they go away after a few generations, so they're not powerful predictors of fourth generation, but they're often powerful predictors of second and third generation. And you can find that the tendency of people to move is predicted by the tendency of people to move back in the home country. So this is somehow brought with the person and then transmitted. and also the strength of family ties. So how important your local kin ties are is culturally transmitted, and it persists after movement. All right. Now markets. Let's see if I can just slip in markets here. This could be bidirectional, but people don't have this, and this could be bidirectional. I find that people aren't skeptical of the idea that if you're more individualistic, you will seek out markets, and if you believe people are more trustworthy, you'll seek out markets. Because if you think people aren't trustworthy, you should never go to a market because you're going to get a bad deal. Someone's going to try to steal from you or screw you over. But another question is, if you're forced to be near a market, do you get more pro-social? Okay, so I showed you this dictator game pattern earlier. So this is the research we did. Now, one of the things we measured is the percent of calories that people purchased in the market versus what they grow. So how market dependent are they? Do they get most of their food from the market? They're at 100%. Or are they subsistence? Are they subsistence agriculturalists where they're not dependent on markets at all for their food? And so this is what we find. Market integration strongly predicts, 0.72, variation in average ultimatum game across these different societies. And you can control for all kinds of things, including individual household wealth, individual income, sex, age, community size, education, and this actually gets a little stronger. So you can get 80% of the variation if you exclude this site, which there's reasons why you might want to do that. Okay, and you get the same pattern. We can use market to predict ultimatum game behaviors and third-party punishment game behaviors. Now the problem with this, there's the weird people. The problem with this is that it doesn't get a causality, right? All we're saying is there's a correlation. But subsequent work building on our stuff, I think, does allow us to get the causality. So there's two studies, both by economists. So Devish Roshtagi, who actually visited our lab at one point, did work in 53 different communities in Ethiopia. And these different communities are tied to their land for the usual complex kinship reasons, that each clan has its land and you have to stay with that land. Then later in history, a market set up. And so what Devish did was he used the distance from where the market is to where the clan land is, and then he tested people in 53 different communities. And he looked at whether the distance from the market would predict their behavior in these experiments, and then whether their measured experiments would predict their willingness to take advantage of voluntary institutions which allowed you to conserve trees. And so he's able to make all of those causal links between the distance from the market, which is exogenous, all the way up to participating in voluntary institutions. Martine Vors has a similar study, although less elegant. And then you can also prime markets and get an increase in trust towards strangers. So this is a standard social psych technique. All right. And I've already mentioned my monogamy connection, so I won't say any more about that. And then finally, there's actually quite a bit of evidence for this link. So when individuals are in voluntary groups, and you can show this in the lab, and there's lots of work on it, you put them into voluntary groups, and you allow those groups to compete, they're more pro-social than if you don't have competition. As soon as you add other groups in competing, everybody's pro-sociality goes up. And you can also, there's also naturalistic studies, which you can read the book. All right, so just a quick summary, this last slide. So I've argued that religion, now you might say, why would the religion decide to do this? Well, the way to think about this is that it didn't really decide in the normal sense, is that there was a whole bunch of different religions competing. A bunch of versions of Christianity didn't make this move. This was the one that made its move, and now it's 90% of all Christians are descended from this. At the time, it was not it was actually a little bit of a backwater. This led to the changing of the kinship systems, which changed people's psychology. It made people a bit more individualistic, a bit more impersonally pro-social, a bit more inclined towards egalitarian relationships. And that then led to the emergence of voluntary organizations, the emergence of charter towns, increase in trade. Now, of course, in the end, this created such powerful secular institutions that at least in European societies, they're dispensing with the whole religion thing. But, you know. All right. Okay, and I'll just wave my arms at this, but if you're thinking about, well, how do we get all this economic growth? Well, you can begin to draw links. So the Industrial Revolution, there's always argument, right? But many historians would say the key thing to explain is how innovation, where did the innovation just started pouring in. And the more they came in, the more economic growth accelerated. And you can show links between analytical thinking and innovation. In that Thomas Talhelm study that I mentioned, he can also link rice growing to more innovation. So the groups who had more rice growing had more clans and less innovation. You can link individualism to innovation. You can link broader social networks to innovation. And these I don't actually have data for. But I bet you can link nonconformity to innovation and a lack of respect for authority to innovation. But I can't put evidence to that yet. So I guess I want to kind of try to encourage what I think is the excitement here, which is that you can use psychology to help address historical and economic questions because psychology is evolving. It's evolving via cultural evolution. And this also helps you do better psychology because along the way here in trying to answer my puzzle about how we became weird, I've begun to establish links between this institution leads to this technology leads to this, and I begin to develop causal linkages between stuff that's evolving in the world and psychology. Okay, so my view is that psychology should be a central player in understanding the functioning of modern institutions, in policy making, in understanding economic development, and economists think this too. So if you looked at this year's World Bank Development Report, it's full of psychology, but it was written by an economist. It was written by an economist who hired a bunch of psychologists to help her. And innovation, right? So, but in order to do that, you need to tap the natural experiments around the globe. And I'll leave it at that.